Hi again, and welcome to our third and our final video on the evolution of birds. So today we'll talk about how birds and their relatives got off the ground and into the air. Now, birds weren't the first animals to evolve flight. Insects have been flying around for a few hundred million years before this, and pterosaurs, which is this different group of reptiles during the Mesozoic, had also been flying for 75 million years or so before birds came around. So, although the birds weren't the first, they're perhaps the best studied example of the evolution of flight. So, you learned in our previous videos that birds are a group of theropod dinosaurs, so just one of the groups that survived until today. You also learned that feathers, this sort of characteristic bird thing, had evolved before birds were around, were present in actually many of the non-bird theropod dinosaurs. So, are birds the only theropod dinosaurs that can fly? Well, these aren't birds here. You might look at them and think that they look very bird-like. Could they fly? So we're going to look at that in this video. So what is needed for flight? Well, at the most basic, to get off the ground, the lift that's produced by the wings and powered by the muscles must be greater than the force of gravity that holds the animal down. So kind of what goes into this balance? Well, first, having a larger wing area will produce more lift, so that's important. Also, having large and powerful flight muscles are needed to generate the lift force by flapping the wings. And finally, it helps to have a small body size so that it's easier to overcome the force of gravity. So, how did all these characteristics change in dinosaurs and in birds? Well, there definitely was a trend towards longer arms in theropod dinosaurs. Some of the earlier theropods, most famously, I suppose, tyrannosaurs, had quite small arms relative to their body size. Sort of, as I said, famously so in Tyrannosaurus, with its little tiny arms. Well, these early theropods also didn't have veined feathers. They just had fuzz, so they had pretty much no chance of flying anyways. But having these tiny arms isn't going to help. However, members of the paraves group, which are the ones on the right side of the phylogeny here, such as dromaeosaurs, troodontids, and early birds, they did have pretty long arms and covered with feathers that would have made, in many cases, a substantial wing. Well, really, the important measure is something called wing loading, which is just the animal's body mass, how much it weighs, divided by the area of its wing. And so if you think about these two dromaeosaur dinosaurs that are shown here, this big one, obviously has a much larger wing in an absolute sense than the small dinosaur, right? Its wing is bigger if you just measured it. But the body mass is going to be much, much larger. So the wing loading, which is the body mass, which is much, much bigger, divided by the wing area, which is just bigger, is larger in this big dromaeosaur. And this is because, this is true for any sort of shape, the three-dimensional volume of an object, which is how much it's going to weigh, increases more quickly than the two-dimensional sort of surface area of any part of that object. So it turns out that being small is super important for flying, which I suppose makes sense if you think about a bird. It's probably pretty small. Even things like swans or geese or pelicans, only weigh about 20 pounds. So, birds are typically not very large and not very heavy. Except for the non-flying birds like ostriches, right? But flying birds are small. So indeed, theropod dinosaurs did become, sort of on average, smaller over time. And it wasn't a smooth trend. It wasn't like, exactly becoming smaller every time. In fact, size increased within many of these subgroups as they evolved. But sort of the estimated weight, of a dinosaur in a lineage decreased from sort of several hundred pounds in the earlier theropods down to just, 10 pounds, a few pounds in the origin of this paraves group, which is our sort of potential flying dinosaurs. And this miniaturization was sort of most pronounced in the early birds, many of which really only weighed a couple pounds or less. So given what we've just seen about wing area and about the body mass of different dinosaurs and birds, did any of our non-avian dinosaurs, the non-bird ones, have the necessary low wing loading values, the small body mass relative to their wing area that they would need for flight? Well, in fact, yes, some did. There are a couple dromaeosaurs that fall clearly below this cutoff, so they definitely have small enough wing loading values. There's a couple others that do also fall below this cutoff, and there's even a few, including one troodontid at the bottom here, that are right around the cutoff for being able to fly. But wing loading is only part of the story because these dinosaurs would also need to have powerful enough muscles to generate that lift by flapping their wings. So let's look at that. Well, one of the really interesting things about modern birds is that they have this pretty sophisticated breathing or respiratory system. They have lungs, obviously, like all land animals do, but also a lot of these air sacs that are actually within their bones. So many of their bones are hollow and filled with air sacs. And that, as you might suspect, helps because it makes birds lighter. They weigh less because they have air instead of bone. But this is also good for, so that's good for flying, but these air sacs can also, they also create a much more efficient respiratory system. So they can get more oxygen out of the air than we can or mammals can. There's sort of famous examples of birds flying over Mount Everest, and humans, can barely survive up there without oxygen, supplemental oxygen, but birds just fly right over. So getting a lot of oxygen is really important because oxygen is what the muscles need to work and to produce lots of power. So did any dinosaurs have this sophisticated air sac breathing system? Well, yeah, it turns out that air sacs and hollow bones with air sacs are actually pretty widespread in dinosaurs. This feature is called pneumaticity or pneumatic bones, and especially in theropods, many of them had some kind of air sacs and hollow bones. So this particular one here is a vertebra from an ornithomimosaurus. I've shown its position on the phylogeny with the arrow here, and it has sort of extensive air sacs and hollow bones. So this is something that's pretty widespread in theropods, it turns out. Well, birds also have bony connections, sort of like prongs that connect their ribs or that touch one rib from the other. These are called uncinate processes. And their function in modern birds is that it sort of helps flex the rib cage and the chest bones, which pushes air around through the lungs and the air sacs, both, and so it helps them when they're breathing in and when they're breathing out, sort of move more oxygen or more air around. Well, like many other features, these uncinate processes were also present in the non-avian theropods. Here's an oviraptor and a dromaeosaur, and you can see these sort of connections sticking from one rib over to the next. So together, all these features suggest that this bird-like breathing system was largely present before birds, and at least a number of non-avian theropod dinosaurs probably had a similar breathing system and likely therefore would have been able to get lots of oxygen to power their muscles. But did they have large muscles, right? Maybe they just used this to run around fast with their leg muscles and not with their arms. So birds have tremendously large muscles in their chest relative to their body size, and they use these to power the flapping motion of the flight stroke, as it's called. So in fact, in birds, these flight muscles are often more than 1/10 of the total weight of the bird, which is a huge amount. And so they're attached to this very large sternum or breastbone. They have these sort of strong strut-like coracoid bones and a flexible spring-like wishbone or furculum, as it's technically called. Well, you've heard in a previous video that the wishbone is also actually present in many theropod dinosaurs, but it looks different. It's not as tightly curved as in modern birds. And even in Archaeopteryx, which is the one on the right here, the wishbone is sort of a more broadly curved kind of boomerang shape. So maybe it wasn't quite as effective as like a spring-like thing for the flapping motion. The sternum is actually kind of complicated. So some theropods, some dromaeosaurs, have these sort of larger fused sternum or chest breastbones. And that's important for providing a large area to attach big muscles to. But then Archaeopteryx and some of the other early birds don't have this broad and fused sternum. So that implies that there's some complexity in sort of the evolution of this character and perhaps the evolution of flight in general. Okay, well, if we take all these characters and then try to estimate sort of muscle power from it, do any of our dinosaurs here now meet both criteria? do they both have sort of the low wing loading values and also sufficient power for lift? Well, Archaeopteryx is out. Nice try. Thanks for playing. Better luck next time. That leaves us with just a couple candidates here. But we finally do have a winner, as Microraptor seems to meet both of the targets. And Rahonavis, this other early dromaeosaur from Madagascar, actually, also seems to satisfy both of the demands. So it does look like at least a couple of the non-bird theropods perhaps would at least potentially be able to fly. Well, if we look at this phylogeny of this Paraves group, birds and their closest relatives, it actually looks like multiple groups were evolving right around this threshold for powered flight. Sort of the potential, or being close to the potential, is most widespread in the bird lineage, but at least a couple, three separate groups of dromaeosaurs also had the potential for flight as well. And this really shouldn't be surprising, because evolution is really never a linear process. Instead, groups are trying out a bunch of different things. It's even possible that different of these Paravians might have even flown in different ways, kind of this sort of messy experimentation process. Now, even though many of these early birds were experimenting with flight, they probably weren't very good at it still. They probably weren't as good as modern birds are, and that's because a lot of the sort of important adaptations for flight actually came later. So, for example, the fusion of this long tail-like tail vertebrae into this short fused pygostyle, it's called, which allows them to have a fan-shaped tail feathers, which is good for providing lift, sort of additional lift. These early ones didn't have this tiny digit on their hand called an alula, which is very important for maintaining lift when the bird is flying slowly, like when it's trying to land on a branch to perch there. The sternum got bigger and stronger with a big keel or ridge down the middle for even more muscle attachment. So these features all evolved later on in other Cretaceous stem group birds and weren't found in these earliest birds. Okay, well, so the final thing we'll look at is so how did these dinosaurs and these birds make the shift from living on the ground, like walking around or running around, to being able to fly? So there are kind of two main sort of, end member possibilities out there. And the first is called the cursorial hypothesis, and cursorial just means running. So this is sort of a ground-up idea that the dinosaurs are running around, and that ultimately turns into them jumping up and flying or whatever. And the second is called the arboreal hypothesis, and that proposes that there's some kind of sort of intermediate gliding stage where they climb up in trees and then glide, and that gets refined into flapping and powered flight. So, of these, the arboreal one, the gliding one, certainly seems like it's probably more straightforward. You're taking advantage of gravity rather than fighting against it. But, what have been the arguments for or against each of these? Well, one of the main arguments actually for the cursorial hypothesis is that theropod dinosaurs, like all the ones that we know of, look like they are fast-running and ground-dwelling animals. They don't seem to have any obvious adaptations for climbing up and hanging around in trees a lot. And that would have been important for them to glide. They would have to be living in trees a bunch. So there have been debates about, claw shape in these dinosaurs, whether that would be consistent with climbing in, trees or not. But overall, they look like ostriches. They look like animals that run around quickly on the ground. However, animals can be quite happy climbing in trees, even if they don't have any obvious skeletal adaptations for such a behavior, just like these goats here, which are happy enough up in a tree eating the leaves. The alternative, that dinosaurs that were running around on the ground sort of transitioned to flying by making jumps or whatever, also seems a bit far-fetched, you might imagine. Well, there actually is a potential sort of transitional stage between running and flying, and that's this thing called wing-assisted incline running. And this is a behavior that is seen in modern birds, and it involves flapping their wings to help them walk up steep hills or inclines, tree trunks or whatever. So this is a plausible mechanism for what wings could be doing before they allowed flight. So perhaps dinosaurs were flapping their little arms and wings around to help them run faster, up hills or up fallen tree trunks or whatever. Maybe they're even more maneuverable. They can use their wings to turn more quickly as they're chasing prey or whatever. And that could be done before they're able to fly, and that could be kind of the selective thing which is helping them. And the ones that have slightly bigger wings do a little bit better, and so they have more offspring and so forth. But overall, it's important to emphasize that flight wasn't a goal of evolution. It wasn't like these things were like trying to evolve to fly. It wasn't a better way of living, right? It wasn't a better way of getting around. Organisms such as dinosaurs and these early birds were doing a whole bunch of different things. And sometimes those things ended up having a little bit of a benefit, and sometimes perhaps not. In fact, dromaeosaurs had some species that probably could fly, like microraptors shown here. But there were also a lot of them, later on that evolved later on to become bigger, large body size, probably to become, large, fast-running predators on the ground. So evolution isn't a direct or a linear progression. It's almost certain that there was a diversity of approaches to movement, to flight in these dinosaurs and these early birds. Well, that's it for early birds and for flight, so thanks for listening.